And we're going to finish the 12th and final chapter of The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, which is called The Return of Ulysses. Toad is back in Toad Hall, the weasels have cleared out, and Mole is correcting the terrible invitations Toad wrote to the banquet. At last, the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who, on leaving the others, had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful, his brow resting on his paw. He pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a sly, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room, and arranged them in a semicircle, and took his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice. Letting himself go with uplifted voice, he sang to the enraptured audience, that his imagination so clearly saw. Toad's last little song. The toad came home. There was panic in the parlors and howling in the halls. There was crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls. When the toad came home. When the toad came home. There was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was shitting of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are hooting as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud in honor of the animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud, with great unction and expression, and when he had done, he sang it all over again, and then he heaved a deep sigh. A long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities, but Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all, or sometimes for a change. On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arm around Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badgers was the mastermind. The mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to every one. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all, Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals, he stole a glance at Badger and the rat, and always when he looked, they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of, "Toad, speech! Speech from Toad's song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and by pressing delicacies on his guests, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that his dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives so rudely broken up by a civil war, the great joy and contentment undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the jailer's daughter, with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative, and the engine driver in his turn was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Under severe compulsion from the badger, even the barge woman was, with some trouble, sought out, and the value of her horse discreetly made good to her, though Toad kicked terribly at this, holding himself to be an instrument of fate, sent to punish fat women with mottled arms, who couldn't tell a real gentleman when they saw one. The amount involved, it was true, was not very burdensome, the gypsy's valuation being admitted by local assessors to be approximately correct. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed, so far as they were concerned. And it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the mouths of their holes, and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking along a him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often have heard your father tell." But when their infants were fractious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible grey badger would up and get them. This was a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children, and it never failed to have its full effect. And that is the end of The Wind in the Willows.